My name is Paige Inglot, and I work with ALUS Canada as the Prairie Hub Manager. A little bit of background, ALUS is a Canadian charitable organization that supports a national network of farmers and ranchers who produce ecosystem services on their land. I'm based out of Regina, and as part of my role with ALUS, I support the delivery of the ALUS program across Saskatchewan and Manitoba. And today I am going to be your host. So just a couple of Zoom housekeeping pieces. This session is going to be recorded. You can also use the chat feature throughout. Christine Campbell, I'll just get you to give a little wave. There she is. Christine is going to be keeping an eye on that chat, and she's also going to be our poll ninja for today. We have quite a few speakers, so I'm going to ask that you mute yourselves for the presentation, and then you can unmute yourself after we've gone through all the presentations today. Today, ALUS has partnered with the University of Alberta to share findings and explore the rancher's perspective on grazing systems such as adaptive multi-paddock grazing. During today's virtual workshop, you will be hearing about the findings from the University of Alberta's research, followed by a panel question and an answer discussion with all of the presenters. In a short moment, I'm going to be introducing Dr. Mark Boyce, the research lead. At this point, I'm going to ask Christine to launch a few polls. This is a chance for us to get to know where you guys are from and just check in on your experience with AMP grazing and if you currently use those on your ranch. So we'll leave that poll open for a minute here while I do a little bit of an introduction, and then we'll close the poll before we start our presentations. Globally, grassland ecosystems represent a vast, often underappreciated store of carbon. Sustainable grazing practices offer the potential for maximizing the role of these ecosystems as carbon storehouses and biodiversity safeguards. Dr. Mark Boyce and his team from the University of Alberta have been investigating how cattle graze systems can be adapted to increase carbon storage on the Canadian prairies. They use the data collected to create protocols for supporting the inclusion of grazing strategies in climate mitigation plans. This research has been funded in part by the Government of Canada's Agricultural Greenhouse Gases Program. In addition, the Agricultural Greenhouse Gases Program is supporting ALUS Canada's work to develop community outreach and engagement opportunities, such as today's panel discussion. ALUS Canada and the University of Alberta are connecting with the ranching community across Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba to share the findings of this research and hear a little bit about your experiences with adaptive multi-paddock grazing practices. So as I mentioned, we're going to ask that you wait until the end of the presentations to unmute. And as we're going through these presentations, if you have any burning questions, you can share those in the chat feature. Some of our presenters will be able to respond, and then for any larger group discussion questions, we're going to come back to those as our Q&A. So to introduce Dr. Mark Boyce, he was awarded his PhD from Yale University in 1977 and has been based at the University of Alberta since 1999, where he's now a professor of ecology. He also serves as the Alberta Conservation Association Chair in Fisheries and Wildlife. Mark's research focuses on ecological models with implications for conservation. He's the author of 7 books and more than 300 peer-reviewed publications. In 2016, Mark was awarded the Miroslav Romanowski Medal by the Royal Society of Canada for applications of science to the environment. Mark has dedicated his entire 50-year career to conservation and ecology. So as you can imagine, this was a condensed bio for all of Mark's accomplishments. With that, I'm going to pass it off to Mark, who is going to be introducing our speakers as they move along. And you should also be able to see our poll results at this point. So we're seeing a good number of you from Saskatchewan tonight at 34%. And 76% who currently use adaptive multi-paddock grazing practices. So it's going to be great to learn a bit about the implications of that. All right, I'm going to stop sharing this poll and pass it off to Mark.
Thank you, Paige. First, I need to acknowledge funding from the Agricultural Greenhouse Gas Program of Agriculture and Agri-Foods Canada. This has been a 5-year project, and we're in the final month of that project. So this is essentially a capstone presentation. All of the work isn't done yet. We still have papers to prepare, and some of the analysis isn't quite complete, but we're getting there. We're getting very close, and we do have some preliminary results that are very interesting, and we'll be sharing those with you tonight. Um, I've had terrific collaboration in my department. J.C. Cahill has been great help, a plant ecologist, and over in the Faculty of Agriculture, Life, and Environmental Sciences, there have been three key figures: Edward Bork, Scott Chang, and Cam Carlisle, who are all on this evening. Steve Apfelbaum and Ry Thompson from Applied Ecological Services in Wisconsin have collaborated and collected the soil infiltration data and helped with the sampling design. Richard Teague at Texas A&M University, Bill Salas at Applied Geo Solutions in Durham, New Hampshire, has also been a collaborator. So we've had a very large team working on this project. There are portions of this project that I would not be able to do myself. In fact, I can't even pronounce some of the names of the chemicals that these guys are dealing with. So it's been necessary and appropriate that we have soil scientists and people who do some of the technical things that are beyond my capability in context of soils and carbon. The focus has been on AMP grazing, which has been very popular for some time, and it's evolved. I first learned about um, the holistic grazing concept about 30 years ago, and it's been beat around and it's been controversial at times. Basically, the idea is that you have a very short, high-intensity grazing period followed by a very long rest period. It's also in England and in Australia, they call it mob grazing or holistic grazing, and it's really an extreme form of rotational grazing. Most ranchers in Canada do some form of rotational grazing, but but certainly AMP grazing is a particularly intensive form of it. Um, Study design has been a crucially important part of our study, and it has been the reason that most previous attempts to evaluate the efficacy of AMP grazing have been unsuccessful, and so we've paid particular attention to study design overseen by a statistician, Lyman McDonald from West Incorporated, um, and I think I'm pretty happy with our paired design. We have, as the core, we have 30 AMP ranches distributed across Alberta, Saskatchewan, and uh, um, uh, southwestern Manitoba, and we have 30 non-AMP ranches that are adjacent to those. Edward Bork will be our first speaker, and he's going to explain what this AMP business is all about. Edward is the Matthias, I still can't get it right. Matthias Chair in Rangeland Ecology and Management and Director of the Rangeland Research Institute at the University of Alberta. He has been teaching and conducting research for over 20 years in a variety of topics, including forage agronomy, integrated weed management, grazing systems, grassland ecology, and climate change. And most recently, his focus has been on ecological goods and services associated with grazing, including carbon storage, greenhouse gas reductions, and biodiversity. Edward.
Great, thanks Mark, and good evening everyone. So I guess just to set the context, what I'm going to be going over is basically a summary of some of the biophysical differences that we observe between the AMPs, so the adaptive multi-paddock ranches, and the neighboring ranches. but also reviewing some of the fundamental management differences. And this data that I'm presenting is actually manifestation of the survey level information that was collected from the different producers on whose property we actually conducted all of this work. So the reason why this survey level data is so important, because it establishes the context for the biological differences that some of the other speakers later on are going to be talking about. So whether it's water infiltration or carbon or so on. And so Mark had already mentioned that we had this really widespread distribution of ranches. This is kind of the layout. You can see that there's we had really good distribution across different soil and agroclimatic regions. And I know there's a number of producers that are actually involved in the study in the webinar tonight. So I'm sure we'll be getting all kinds of questions from folks. So that's great. So I'm going to try to keep my my comments and my review to basically some of the high level findings. So first and foremost, we wanted to ask an important question of every producer, which is whether their land that we were actually looking at, the grazing land, the grassland, actually had a history of cultivation. And the reason that was so important is because we know that cultivation history has such a profound impact on changing carbon levels, for example, to begin with. On average, a little bit, slightly higher number of AMP ranches actually had a history of cultivation, around 80% as opposed to 70% of the neighboring AMP ranches. Ideally, when we set up the study, we tried to have them balanced because we wanted to be comparing cultivated to cultivated and non-cultivated to cultivated. That didn't quite work out, but we were very close. All of the ranches generally had a similar average time since planting, somewhere around 20 years. And the other thing that I want to point out, we did ask individual producers what they had seeded down in the case of lands that had been cultivated and were seeded at some point in time. And not surprisingly, most producers had used some kind of legume, usually alfalfa. But the couple things that caught my eye, one of them is that AMP producers were more likely to seed down with native species, which is an interesting potential indication that AMP producers were maybe more likely to think about using native species that might be adapted to the climate and soils of their region. And AMP producers were also more likely to use more complex mixes of species. So where at least 5 or more species were included in a mix. And I thought that was an interesting kind of ancillary outcome. So if we look at the physical ranch attributes associated with both the AMP and the neighboring or NAMP ranches, it became evident right early on that the AMP ranches on average were much larger. So almost 1,400 hectares in size, as opposed to the neighboring ranches, which were only about 300 hectares in size. And of course, the total size of the cattle herd in animal units would reflect that as well, because a larger land base would support a larger herd size. And that raises an interesting question of whether AMP grazing is more likely to occur on a larger land base, whereby maybe the managers of that operation can then spread out their labor across that larger land area, and they can pay more attention to that intensive management that's going on. If we look at the kind of layout of the actual physical pastures within those different types of operations, not surprisingly, the AMP ranches had a much larger number of pastures. Indeed, that was one of the screening criteria that we selected for when we identified our AMP ranches. So on average, AMP producers had roughly 60 paddocks available for grazing across their property, as opposed to the neighbors that had under 10 and usually closer to 5 individual pastures. And of course, the opposite pattern occurred when we looked at pasture size. Again, not surprisingly, the AMP producers were looking at an average paddock size much, much smaller, somewhere around 20 hectares, as opposed to the neighboring producers that were somewhere around 120. So again, you can see the kind of stratification that's happening between our treatment pairs, the AMP and the neighboring producers. Now, in order to quantify the impact of the animals, we collected all kinds of data on what are you grazing, yearlings versus cow-calf pairs, when do you start grazing, when do you end grazing, We combined that with the area that was being grazed, and then we're able to compute a stocking rate and also a stock density. The stock density was computed using the mean paddock size and the number of animal units that were being grazed. Not surprisingly, stock density on the AMP ranches was much, much higher. That's to be expected. And this is an indication of herd effect or animal impact, you know, that we often hear about holistic management and so on. And so this is an expected result because we screened for that kind of difference. However, when we computed the stocking rates between the AMP and the neighboring properties, we were actually expecting to find a much higher stocking rate, and that actually did not occur. While numerically the AMP producers were slightly higher in aggregate stocking rate, that difference was actually non-significant. And I believe the difference is 2.85 animal unit months per hectare for the non-AMP, and for the neighbors or for the AMP themselves, I believe it was around 3.6, something like that, but statistically not different. So maybe a trend towards higher, but really it wasn't in the end. Another interesting aspect that came out is when we looked at the temporal aspect of grazing, AMP ranchers were more likely to start grazing earlier in the spring with a median start date of April 25th as opposed to May 17th for the non-AMP. So that suggests that the AMP producers were actually able to start roughly 3.5 weeks earlier in the spring. And the total grazing season length was actually much longer on the AMP ranches, around 7.1 months as compared to 4.6 months. So again, some really interesting difference in terms of what the AMP producers have been able to achieve through what their management style is. Now, one of the real important aspects in terms of the grazing system itself is an understanding of how producers were basically managing their grazing and the sequence of grazing and duration of grazing during the growing season. And we recognize the period of early season plant growth, which is prior to August 1st. So if you think about May, June, and July growth, we were interested in understanding what's the length of your early season grazing period. And when we ask that question, we start to see a distinct divergence where AMP producers, this is a frequency histogram with the number of producers, most of the AMP producers were basically grazing for less than 8 days during the active growing season, so May, June, and July. And in fact, the majority of them were even 3 days or less, so had a very condensed, short pulse of grazing. Whereas many of our non-AMP were scattered out across all kinds of different frequencies from 8 to 20, even up to greater than 55 days in the case of those that were truly continuous grazing. And of course, the minimum rest period that we asked producers to provide us was, again, the exact opposite, where the AMP producers now were more likely to grant their pastures a much longer period of minimum rest following the early grazing period. In fact, all the AMP producers provided at least 20 days of rest, and the majority of them were 60 days or more. So taking both of these graphs together, we were able to compute a rest to grazing ratio, which is a new metric. This has never been presented before. We had some discussion on this yesterday, and I'm sure we're going to have it again today, which basically looks at the number of days of rest per day of early grazing activity in the months of May, June, and July. And what's interesting is when you calculate that ratio, you start to see a really strong segregation between AMP and non-AMP, where all the AMP producers had a rest to grazing day ratio over 6, and most of them were over 40, whereas a lot of the neighboring properties were under 6 and typically 2 or less. And so this will become important when people later on this evening start talking about RGR. It's this rest to grazing ratio that they will use to explain some of their biological responses. This is my last slide, and I just want to reinforce that the reality is the beef producers in Alberta and Western Canada form a continuum of management. So I cringe at the idea of thinking about AMP and non-AMP producers as this kind of binary distinctly different set of treatments, because that they simply are not. And this is basically an ordination in which I took the survey data and then looked at the dispersion of the individual producers and how they kind of fit in relation to one another. And while it's true that most of the non-AMP producers are all clustered here on the left side of this first axis at the bottom, you can see that the AMP producers actually represent, even amongst themselves, a very broad gradient in management activity. And this is one of the reasons why I think it's so important to interpret the biological responses we're seeing in the field using those nuanced grazing practices of things like rest to grazing ratio, stock density, stocking rate, and so on. Okay, and with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Mark, and we will continue along. I'm sure there's going to be questions on this, and that's great. We'll have a chance to visit later on.
Yes, please hold your questions until the end, and we'll have a question and answer session at the end. Make notes so that you don't forget, but to be able to get through the material, we need to kind of keep a steady flow. So Tim Dobert is going to speak about water infiltration component of the study. Tim is a postdoc at the University of Alberta, focusing on grassland management effects on biodiversity and ecosystem functions. He holds a PhD from the University of Western Australia, where he studied the impacts of logging and oil palm expansion on native plant diversity in Borneo's lowland tropical rainforest. His Master of Science research was at the University of Otago in Dunedin, New Zealand, focused on tropical dry forest recovery in Thailand. So Tim is actually German. In fact, he just got back from the holidays in Germany. Are you still in isolation, undergoing quarantine, Tim?
Yeah, I've got 3 more days to go, so counting.
Okay, so Tim Dobert.
Thank you very much, Mark, and good evening, everyone. Mark, can you see the slides okay?
Yes.
Okay, good. So before I'm starting, I would like to acknowledge that our collaborators at Ecological Services collected the water infiltration and soil sample data, which I'm going to talk about in this particular aspect of our larger project. So I'm going to explore the question of whether adaptive multi-paddock grazing alters water infiltration in Western Canada's grasslands. And why is this question important? Well, foremost because water infiltration largely determines soil water availability, which of course
Tim, we can see your notes as well.
Oh, okay. Oh, sorry, it's not.
Yeah, it will get there for a brief moment.
Okay, just a moment, sorry. Is that better?
Yes, that's good.
Okay, perfect. Sorry. Yeah, so why is this important? Well, it's fundamental to productivity and the capacity of grasslands to provide various ecosystem goods and services. So a better understanding of the nuanced grazing practices is going to allow us to really understand the hydrological processes. And this is important not just to adapt for ranchers, to adapt to a warming climate and increasing frequency of droughts, which have been forecasted for large parts of the Canadian prairies, but it's also going to contribute towards mitigating the effects of climate change. So I'm first going to briefly talk about the setup. So we used 52 for this particular water infiltration study and collected 3 measurements per ranch. And those measurements were aligned with for sampling locations. So we use this, it's called a Saturo dual head meter, and it basically measures the ease with which water infiltrates into the soil. In addition to water infiltration measurements, we collected data on plant litter, soil texture, and soil bulk density, because those are very important biophysical parameters to determine water infiltration. So I'm first going to show a few basic results. So if we're looking at the first panel, A, to the left, we're looking at the relationship between water infiltration rate and plant litter. And we can see that water infiltration on AMP ranches increases as more litter accumulates, whereas there is no significant pattern observed for neighboring ranches. And a positive relationship is really what we would expect, because usually increases in litter prevent runoff of water and evaporation. Looking at the second panel, B, we're finding that water infiltration was positively correlated with soil texture. And soil texture in this case is expressed as the ratio between clay and sand content. So this finding is somewhat surprising. We would have expected that more sandy soils allow or facilitate higher water infiltration. Finally, panel C, we're finding that bulk density, increases in bulk density, so basically as the soil is becoming more compact, is decreasing water infiltration. And this is consistent across grazing systems and something we would really expect. So delving into a more complex analysis, here in the first one, we're looking at AMP versus neighboring ranches. And we're combining the grazing system and biophysical parameters. Here we're finding that AMP grazing is really facilitating infiltration of water. So there's a significant benefit to AMP grazing. And the average rate for AMP ranches is 10.5 centimeters per hour, whereas for neighboring ranches, it's 7.4 centimeters. And finally, looking at the more nuanced grazing practices, which Edward just described. So for example, the rest to grazing ratio and stocking rate and animal unit density. We're first finding in panel A that amongst the biophysical parameters, bulk density is most important. And as we saw earlier for the basic plots, there is a decreasing rate of water infiltration as bulk density increases. Second, we're finding that the rest to grazing ratio is in fact very important, and there's a significant relationship on AMP ranches where the longer the rest, sorry, it's not on AMP ranches, but the longer the rest to grazing ratio, the higher the water infiltration. And this is closely related to AMP grazing, because rest to grazing ratio is one of the parameters which are really characterizing AMP grazing. And finally, looking at stocking rate, we're not finding a significant result, but we're finding a trend where increases in stocking rate are leading to a decrease in water infiltration, and something that's not shown in those panels. So we also included the animal unit density metric, so basically a reflection of the herd effect, and we're not finding that a herd effect is leading to any improved water infiltration rates. So overall, we're showing that rest periods are critical for water infiltration more than the effects of livestock presence directly. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tim. Our next speaker is Jessica Grenke. Jessica is a PhD student in J.C. Cahill's lab in the Department of Biological Sciences at the University of Alberta. She's studying vegetation ecology associated with alternative grazing practices. Jessica.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, it's fine.
Yep.
It's fine.
Great. Perfect. All right. So I'd like to thank everybody for coming today. I'm very excited at this chance to share some of the results about the plants. And I'm very honored to be part of this, such an illustrious team of researchers. So I'll be giving a very quick overview of how AMP grazing management systems influence plant diversity, composition, and production among our study sites. So before we begin, the results I'm going to be talking about are sourced from 36 ranches, so that's 18 pairs within the broader study data set. And these were the ranches we were able to sample within our study times for 2 years running. And being able to combine the results of those 2 years together reduces the influence of climate on our results and gives us some more confidence in them. So keep that in mind. I'll also mention that the sites were slope stratified. So a third of them were on high slopes, a third on mid slopes, a third on low slopes. And wherever possible, I've accounted for that within our analysis. Also, one last caveat before I dive in, there are a lot of nuances that I've had to cut out here, just as it is a 5-minute talk. And I'm more than happy to discuss them later in question period. So to get into it. First of all, we have diversity. So there are two main types of, there are two main ways of considering number of species. We have the average number of species per plot. So that was the quadrats that we were sampling, which are 0.5 meter by 0.5 meter squares. And here we found that there are significantly more species in non-AMP ranches than AMP ranches. So that it's a very slight difference though. Though it is real, it's only a difference of about 1 species. So on average, we found 9 species per plot in an AMP ranch and 10 species per plot in a non-AMP ranch. And then you can scale up to the number of species found on average for a whole ranch. And there we found the same trend. So there were more species on non-AMP ranches than AMP ranches. The difference was more marked, simply likely because there are more species, so the difference will also be bigger. And we found there were about 22 species on average for AMP ranches and 27 on average for a non-AMP ranch. So delving more a bit into that, trying to look at how native or introduced species might be playing into this larger picture, we find that there are significantly more native species in terms of percent cover per quadrats on non-AMP ranches than AMP ranches. And this difference is you'll find about 65% cover native species in an AMP ranch and 74% in a non-AMP ranch. And the differences between cover of introduced species was not really different between an AMP and a non-AMP ranch. So you can see on my graph here, the means are about the same on that bar plot, which does make sense as the ranches that we sampled were mostly introduced species. So mostly we didn't get a lot of high native coverage. So, you know, introduced species are running the show here. The other part of the puzzle that I was hoping to get into was how variability might be affected by AMP status. So what I mean by that is how much plant communities change across a certain area. So we might expect to see more variance in an AMP ranch, which has like more finer, pinpointed, intensive management. So, you know, if you're getting that very fine, intensive, pinpointed impacts to the landscape, you might expect that to translate to greater variability of the landscape in the plant community. But this was not the case. So we found no differences in variability of plant species between plots or in the plant community. So that's evenness between plots here. So you'll see the means are all about the same, nothing significant. I think that that's shown well in this ordination in the lower corner here. So what I've done is I've collapsed all the complexities of each ranch's plant community into one point in space. So each point is one ranch, and the closer the points are, the more similar the ranches are. And I've connected pairs of ranches together with arrows. So if we did find changes in the plant community that were in line with changes in management, I would expect to see the arrows pointing in similar directions, right? As the plant community changes in a similar way. And if you look at this, you can see the arrows are going all different directions. There is no real trend here. So the takeaway is there are not massive changes in the plant community by any means. Certainly not for variability, and not even really for diversity either. The changes are very slight. So moving over to biomass, what we find is AMP ranches have far more above ground production than a non-AMP ranch on average. And this was significant and just very, very clear. We also find greater litter coverage in an AMP ranch compared to a non-AMP ranch as well. It's less dramatic, but it is definitely still there. We do not find a difference in below ground biomass. So my team and I took soil cores and then transported those cores back to lab, washed them, and then weighed them. And we don't find a difference. You can see the means are different, but statistically that doesn't come out. So we're seeing more above ground production in AMP ranches, more litter in AMP ranches, and no difference in below ground biomass. So this is my acknowledgement slide. I would like to thank all of the ranchers for participating. We are so grateful, as well as the funding agencies and all of the technicians who helped along the way. So thank you.
Thank you, Jessica. Our next speaker is coming to us from Olds. Lio Silva Sobrino is a graduate student with Scott Chang. He's proposing to defend his thesis by the end of this month. And he's going to talk to us about the soil carbon differences between the grazed and between the AMP and neighboring AMP, non-AMP ranches. Lyle.
Yes, I'm just sharing my screen. It's all right, you can all see that?
Yes, it's good.
Okay, thanks for the introduction, Mark. So as Mark already said, in my master's, I focused on the carbon component of the AGGP project. And this talk is, my presentation is going to be specifically about it, about how we can manage grassland grazing to boost soil carbon sequestration. And just so you know, before I start, the data that I used here for this presentation is from the AH layer, but we collected 1 meters deep soil cores throughout all the ranches that Edward has presented. And from those 60 ranches, the data I'm presenting is from 52. And the reason why I'm going to talk only about the AH layer is because going down below the AH layer at the subsoil, we did not find any effect of grazing management on carbon sequestration or on carbon concentration at the subsoil level. So here, as we can see here in these two graphs, on A, I'm analyzing the effect of stocking rate and rest to graze ratio on AH layer depth, and on B, I'm showing the effect of stocking rate and rest to graze ratio on soil organic carbon mass. As Edward already talked about, the non-AMP sites have a rest to graze ratio close to 0, whereas the AMP ranches have a rest to graze ratio from 20 to around 100. And just so just to remind you, rest to graze ratio is the number of rest days to grazing days between the grazing period of 15th of March to July 31st, which is what we're calling early grazing. And here on the axis, on the horizontal axis, we can see stocking rate that goes from 0 to 11. And we see the interaction between stocking rate and rest to graze ratio by looking at the colored lines. So we see, for instance, here at the blue line for the AH layer, that for the non-AMP sites, even without or with almost no rest to graze ratio, we still see an increase in the AH layer depth, even without any rest period, just with the presence of stocking, just with the presence of animals. And we do see that as we increase the rest to graze ratio, we have a deepening of the AH layer. From 20 to 100, we see an increase in the deepening of the AH layer. So it starts at around 21 centimeters in depth for the the rest to graze ratio of 0, and then it goes beyond 33 centimeters in depth for the rest to graze ratio at the highest stocking rate of 11 animal unit month per hectare. And when we look at the graph, the graph that shows the relationship between soil organic carbon and how it's affected by stocking rate and rest to graze ratio, we also see that same relationship. We see that at the 0 rest to graze ratio, actually the soil organic carbon almost doesn't increase, and actually it seems like there's a slight decrease in soil organic carbon mass, whereas for the rest to graze ratios of 20 to 100, we see increase in soil organic carbon mass as the stocking rate increases as well. So what these two graphs combined show us is that stocking rate and rest to graze ratio combined, higher stocking rate and higher rest to graze ratio provides a higher, deeper, a thickening of the AH layer, and therefore higher carbon sequestration. And that's widely discussed in literature. And the reason why we attribute that is that the thickening of the AH layer due to the rest to graze ratio, the higher rest to graze ratio, is because as you give more time for the grasses to rest, they have more time for the roots to regrow and for the carbohydrates to get deeper into the soil, as the roots also grow deeper into the soil due to the rest to the longer period of rest. And that this is what we attribute to the higher carbon sequestration at the AMP sites. Thank you.
Lau, someone just asked a question. What's the AH layer? Do you want to just define that quickly for them?
Yeah, so the AH layer is actually the A horizon, and usually we define the AH layer as the horizon that has a darker color and that has a carbon concentration of less than 18%. Because beyond that, then we'd call it the O horizon, but basically that's what we call the basic definition of the AH layer. It's basically the AH horizon, but with a higher concentration of carbon.
Yeah. We always called it topsoil.
Yeah, topsoil, more commonly known.
Yeah. So thank you very much, Lyle. Our next speaker is Bharat Shrestha. Bharat has been a research associate on this project, the AGGP project, from 2017 to 2019, supervised by Scott Chang. And he's been studying greenhouse gas exchange associated with the grazing regimes. He's currently working as the biology study lead on soil health and fertility development at the Agriculture and Agri-Foods Canada research farm in Beaver Lodge, northwestern Alberta. And he's going to focus today, though, on the greenhouse gas exchange work that he did in Alberta. Bharat.
Thank you, Mark. Do you hear me correctly? It's okay?
Yes, very good. Yep.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Today I'm going to present the effect of adaptive multi-paddock grazing on soil greenhouse gas emission. And we published this paper in Agronomy Journal already. My co-authors are listed here. And if you have any question after the presentation, I will be happy to answer afterward. So objective of this study was to determine whether adaptive multi-paddock grazing changes greenhouse gas fluxes from grassland soils relative to neighboring conventional grazing. Next was to test whether grazing system has altered the sensitivity of grassland greenhouse gas flux to change in soil temperature and moisture. We did it in incubation experiment in the lab. And next was to evaluate linkages between grazing regime, temperature, moisture, and resulting greenhouse gas fluxes as mediated by soil microbes and enzyme activities. In the right side of this slide is the map of the ranches location in Alberta. We did this greenhouse gas study in Alberta site only because they represent almost all soil zones, and it is because also it needs a biweekly measurement of the in situ greenhouse gas that will be presented later by Geelong. So what we did is that we collected soil from 11 pair of AMP and neighboring ranch across our climate gradient in Alberta. We processed the soil and did 102-day lab incubation experiment at 5 degrees centigrade and 25 degrees centigrade temperature. And we also changed the moisture level in 3 level, permanent wilting point, 40% of field capacity and field capacity. Then we measured soil's microbial and chemical parameters, all the you can see all the way in the right side. And there we then we measure also enzyme activities. They are related to carbon cycling and nitrogen cycling, and then finally their effect on the greenhouse gas. And we use the structural equation model to see the direct effect of temperature, moisture, and grazing, and then indirect effect of these microbial and chemical parameters and enzyme activities. Then we found that in respect to temperature change, this is AMP ranch, which is producing more carbon dioxide at low temperature of 5 degrees centigrade, but at 25 degrees centigrade, AMP soils are producing less carbon dioxide compared to neighboring ranch. And to emission didn't differ between grazing types, but of course they increase with the temperature. And this is the interesting result. We found that methane consumption was always higher in AMP ranch at low temperature and also at high temperature. So in terms of moisture, when moisture increased, also the emission of the carbon dioxide increased. We see a little bit deep in at 40% of field capacity. And same as with the temperature, with moisture also at the field capacity, always there was more methane consumption in AMP soils. Then from this experiment, what we can say is that the emission of carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide, and uptake of methane increase with greater soil temperature and moisture level. Soils under AMP grazing consume more methane compared to non-AMP soils. AMP soils emit more carbon dioxide compared to non-AMP soils at colder temperature, but it emits less in the warmer temperature. Microbial carbon or microbial biomass play an important role as an indirect driver of GHG flux by influencing the soil enzyme responsible for carbon and nitrogen cycling. The last message is that grasslands should have ample amount of litter to keep soils in ambient temperature to minimize greenhouse gas emissions in the future warming climate. So I would like to acknowledge my co-authors and then AFC's AGGP program, participating ranchers, graduate and summary students, and lab mates at the Forest Soil Lab at Department of Renewable Resources at University of Alberta. And this is the reference. Our published paper is there. And here are some pictures representing how we collected soil, how we processed, and how incubation experiment was done. Thank you.
Thank you, Bharat. Our next talk is coming to us from Zhilong Ma, who is at Sun Yat-sen University in China. And Christine will roll his presentation, which has been pre-recorded, because we're roughly 12 hours off from where he is, I think, and it was more convenient for him to record the presentation.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's hope that this works. I'll try putting it into larger screen.
There's this global pandemic. I'm Zhilong Ma, previously a postdoc at the University of Alberta and currently working at Sun Yat-sen University in China. Today, I will mainly introduce some of the main results from my part of the AGGP project, which is the effects of grazing management, climate, and soil properties on the field greenhouse gas fluxes within grazed grassland of Alberta. As we know, adaptive multi-paddock grazing, which is also called AMP, where livestock are placed in small pastures for relatively short period of time at high stocking density, is thought to be an important tool to sustainable managed grazing lands. However, whether grasslands subject to AMP are superior to conventional grazing in terms of greenhouse gas emission reduction, and what are the relative contribution of the key management, climatic, and soil factor in regulating seasonal mean greenhouse gas fluxes are still unknown. So the main objective of this study is to answer those two questions. So in this study, we measured soil carbon dioxide, methane, and nitric oxide fluxes in 12 pairs of ranches under either AMP or conventional grazing system, distributed across Alberta over 3 growing seasons, which is 2017 to 2019. And we found that irrespective of grazing system applied, all ranch soils were a constant source of carbon dioxide and nitric oxide, while consistently being a methane sink. However, we found that soil greenhouse gas fluxes did not differ between AMP and conventional grazing system, as indicated by their similar patterns over time for all 3 greenhouse gas fluxes. Instead, we found that seasonal mean greenhouse gas fluxes were regulated by the management, climatic, and soil factors, including cattle stocking rates, cultivation history, soil moisture, and bulk density. As we can see in the table, for seasonal mean carbon dioxide fluxes, the final model was able to explain 70% of the total variance, with stocking rates, soil moisture, and their interaction being the most important explanatory variables. So the selected final model explained 80% of the total variance inherent in the seasonal mean methane fluxes, with cultivation and bulk density being the most influential variables, followed by the soil moisture. And the dynamic of nitric oxide emission were likely tied to clay content, but its effects are hardly detectable. So specifically, we found that carbon dioxide fluxes increased with stocking rates only in moist soil, as indicated by the blue solid line in the figure. It implies that soil carbon dioxide emission are sensitive to increasing grazing intensity, especially in moist soil. So for massing, we found that seasonal mean massing uptake was lower in grasslands with a previous history of cultivation, as shown in Figure 3a. And among climatic factors, we found that seasonal mean massing uptake decreased with greater soil moisture, as indicated in Figure 3b. And for soil properties, we found that bulk density was the main driver of seasonal mean massing fluxes, with higher bulk density reducing massing uptake. An important objective in this study was a comparative assessment of AMP and conventional grazing system in terms of field greenhouse gas emissions. Our results, however, demonstrate that soil greenhouse gas fluxes did not differ between grasslands subject to AMP and conventional grazing, but instead were regulated by a set of management and environmental factors, including cattle stocking rates, cultivation history, soil moisture, and bulk density. And specifically, we show that seasonal mean carbon dioxide emissions significantly increased with increasing stocking rates only in moist soil. And the seasonal mean massing uptake decreased with increasing soil moisture and soil bulk density, and was significantly lower in grasslands with cultivation history. So those are the take-home messages for this study, and thank you very much for your time.
Thank you for Christine for sharing that. Scott Chang will be here after the presentations and can answer questions about Zhilong's presentation. The next speaker is Upama. Upama is a PhD candidate in the Department of Agriculture, Food and Nutritional Sciences at the University of Alberta, and her research is focused on soil microbial ecology in response to alternative grazing systems. Upama. Upama, you're still muted.
So, can you hear me?
Yes, that's good. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mark. Today I'm talking on the soil microbial community, what does AMP grazing affect on its abundance, biodiversity, and biomass. So soil microbes are the living component in the soil, and they are billions in number, even in a teaspoon of the soil. And they are very diverse and vary in size, even within a small soil environment, and they play an important role in the ecosystem functioning and processes like organic matter decomposition, and play a vital role in carbon and nitrogen cycling, and also are responsible for the emission and consumption of the greenhouse gases. And the cattle grazing affect this microbial community through various way, like by removing the vegetation and trampling and input of the nutrient in the soil, which changes to the soil physical chemical properties and soil microclimates, and also which affect the vegetation community and which eventually influence the microbial communities. So we found that the microbial biomass carbon to nitrogen ratio is affected by the grazing system as well as the stocking rate. And this microbial biomass carbon usually increases with the increasing soil carbon. And we can see this ratio decreases with the increasing stocking rate. And this may be due to the removal of the vegetation which affect the root development, and which provides the main source of the food to the microbial community, and reducing the litter layer on the surface, and also the input of the nitrogen in the soil through the urinations. So similarly, fungal to bacterial ratio is also affected by the grazing system as well as the stocking density. This fungal to bacterial ratio is considered as an indicator of soil quality and usually linked to the higher carbon storage. And we can see this ratio is slightly higher in non-AMP branches than the AMP. And having the higher fungal abundance indicate that it can store more soil organic carbon through enhancing the fungal mediated soil aggregates and slowing down the turnover rate of the soil carbon. And this ratio decreases with the stocking density, and it might be because stocking density creates different kind of soil metric changes, like the increase in bulk density, soil compaction, and to which the fungal community usually negatively responds. And the archaeal community, which are mainly responsible for the methane production, its diversity is higher in non-AMP than the AMP grazing. And this finding aligns with the Bharat finding where the non-AMP produces more methane gas than the AMP. And this Euarchaeota is that second most abundant community that we have found in our study region, and they are mainly belongs to the methanogenic community which produce the methane gas. And in summary, AMP grazing influences microbial biomass carbon to nitrogen ratio and fungal to bacterial ratio, as well as the methanogenic diversity. And stocking density and stocking rate are the one which affect the fungal to bacterial ratio and microbial biomass to carbon ratio respectively. And I would like to thanks to all the people who are involved in this project and the funding agencies, and special thanks to the rancher who allowed us to sample in their land. Thank you.
Thank you, Upama. Our next speaker is Darin Kalyaskar, and Darin is in Kazakhstan, and so instead we'll get to hear Scott Chang give his presentation. And Scott is a professor of soil science in the Department of Renewable Resources at the University of Alberta, and his research aims to understand how global change in land management influence the biogeochemistry of carbon, nitrogen, and other nutrients, including greenhouse gas emissions and soil carbon sequestration. He serves the scientific community as an editor or on the editorial board of Biology and Fertility of Soils, Pedosphere, and Biochar. Scott, you can unmute yourself.
Thank you. You can hear me? I just unmuted myself.
We can hear you.
Great. Thank you, Mark, for the introduction. And it's my pleasure to present the results from part of Doran's master thesis. Some of his master thesis work has already been presented in Bharat's presentation. And that part of the work was based on a lab incubation study. But this part of the work was based on some field study using exactly the same research range that Bharat sampled, and I believe the same branches that Zilong's presentation or Zilong's work sampled as well. So this work is about actual enzyme activities in rangeland, in grasslands, and how they are affected by grazing systems. And he also evaluated the effect of cultivation as well. The objective for this study is to look at the role that grazing systems and cultivation, I guess that was kind of an add-on question that we studied, on the activities of 6 different extracellular enzymes as an indicator of soil biological activities. So those 6 extracellular enzymes are listed in the table below. Exactly the 4 same enzymes that Bharat studied, plus the urease and the phosphatase activities. So these 6 enzymes are classified into carbon cycling, nitrogen cycling, as well as phosphorus cycling. This is a grant result from the field work that Doran did, looking at the influence of the grazing systems on the enzyme activities of the 6 enzymes. So I guess the main finding here is that statistically speaking, there was no statistically significant difference between the AMP and the non-AMP grazing systems. The trends that we can see here is that for the beta-glucosidase activity tends to be higher in the AMP ranges as compared to the non-AMP. The second trend here is the phosphatase activity tended to be higher in the AMP grading system as well as compared to the non-AMP grading system. So the indication is that for some of the carbon cycling enzymes, they will be enhancing carbon cycling in or increase the rate of carbon cycling in the AMP ranges as reflected by the beta-glucosidase, as well as potentially increasing the phosphorus cycling in the AMP ranges. Dolan dug a bit deeper in terms of trying to find relationships between some of these enzyme activities in relation to stocking rate, to the rest to graze ratio, and also whether cultivation had an impact on enzyme activities. So some of the trends, I guess we didn't put any lines in the first two graphs. The first one is looking at the urease versus the stocking rate. There was a trend for the urease activity to increase with increasing stocking rate. But again, statistically speaking, there was no significance. The second trend was for the beta-glucosidase activity to increase with increasing rest to graze ratio. Again, no statistical significance there. The last thing that he did was looking at the cultivation effect. Out of the 6 enzyme activities, the xylosidase activity was significantly higher in the non-cultivated ranches as compared to the cultivated ranches. So indicating that the cultivation had a huge impact on this particular enzyme responsible for carbon cycling. And he's been calling that as a legacy effect of cultivation. Obviously, cultivation occurred a lot earlier than when he sampled these research sites. So as a summary, his work found no overall effect of grazing system effect on the 6 enzyme activities that he studied. The second take-home message is for the beta-glucosidase activities. That's indication we saw organic carbon decomposition potential tended to increase with increasing length of rest period. And the last point here is the cultivation had a long-lasting legacy effect on the xylosidase activity. And he wanted to thank, I can't read, but this is a foundation in Kazakhstan that supported part of his study in the form of a scholarship. And the research obviously was supported by Agriculture Ag Food Canada. Thank you.
Thank you, Scott. Our next speaker is Kira Luskaya, and Kira is a master's student in risk and community resilience in the ALUS faculty at the University of Alberta, and her research is in the area of environmental sociology, complementing the other kinds of work going on on this project. So Kira.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Mark. I'm going to start sharing my screen, hopefully soon. Hold on. Here we go. So as Mark mentioned, I am a student of risk and community resilience, which means that I'm a social scientist, a little bit different and complementary, hopefully, to the rest of the project. I have attempted to look at how alternative grazing managers are perceiving the scientific communication that is associated with grazing and making decisions about environmental management on their farm. So a little bit about the context, as many of you are familiar with the ranching environment, you are already fairly aware of this. However, conventional beef production and conventional agriculture have been under scrutiny, and there's been some this perception that they have a negative environmental impact, and that has been fairly supported. However, what exactly to do about that and how to mitigate environmental impact, perhaps even provide environmental benefits through agriculture, and the specific practices and the impacts of these practices have been under some debate. However, as policymakers and ranchers are all aiming to make decisions about ranch management and environmental stewardship, they're doing so in this context of uncertainty. As much as we like to think research and scientific inquiry are extremely effective at affecting change on the ground, this doesn't happen until producers and landowners and managers choose to implement certain practices. And so that's what my study aims to figure out. How are science, scientists, and scientific institutions perceived among alternative livestock management practitioners in the Canadian prairies? Understanding a bit more about the rancher's perspective, especially those who consider themselves alternative, will help scientists and policymakers, as well as NGOs and other organizations, figure out how to communicate effectively and do relevant research. So a little bit about my study design. I conducted quite a few in-depth interviews with ranchers that I recruited partly from the main study that we're talking about here, as well as to expand that pool a little bit to increase the size and a little bit of diversity for the ranchers that I interviewed. I ended up conducting 18 interviews with 20 ranchers. They ranged between about 45 minutes to 2 hours or more. And I will be conducting thematic analysis as well as actor network analysis. So a little bit of social science terms there, but basically looking at what exactly these ranchers said and the context from which they gained that perspective, and hopefully influence the decision-making among policymakers and scientists in the long run. Some of the preliminary themes that I found were that ranchers who had this alternative grazing mindset also had more of a humans within nature mindset, which is slightly different from what has been found in conventional perspectives. And this emphasis on mimicking nature is also strong, as is the focus on flexibility. So rigid systems are not something that is appreciated or implemented within these types of alternative practices. And some of the trusted sources include some forage associations, producers especially with similar practices, and specific speakers that were evaluated on a basis of perception and personality. And there was, of course, money motives, but this was kind of split in the sense that some people rejected money as the main goal, whereas some people saw that as the main component of why they choose to ranch the way they do. With regard to the actual science, perceptions, science as a concept, the scientific method, etc., was generally accepted. And however, the practice sometimes was considered inadequate due to funding or an underlying inability to handle complexity. And this is the perception that was communicated through the interviews. But again, if a scientific study supports what they're doing, everyone's happy, right? We all like hearing that what we're doing is right. The perception of individual scientists depended a little bit again on that personality aspect, and especially if there was some personal connection. Scientific institutions were evaluated kind of based on, again, the funding and where that perceived bias is based on who is funding the research, but they're not necessarily looked to as the sources of new ideas and new innovation, but more so as confirming, verifying, and checking existing kind of new practices that were led by producers themselves. So thank you very much. I'd like to thank ranchers who gave their time and expertise greatly appreciated, and the AGGP project at large for welcoming a rather unconventional piece of the study. So thank you very much. And the questions again will be during the breakout rooms.
Thank you, Kira. Our last student presentation this evening will be by Kyle Wheeler. Kyle is a master's student in the same department that Kira is in, but in the agricultural economics arena. And his work is focused on the impact of grazing management decisions on farm economic outcomes and the environmental impact that it could, as it could pertain to future policy and market potential. Kyle, you can unmute yourself.
Bring this up. Oh, hello, everybody. Good evening. I am the economist attached to this project. As you can see, my slide is titled AMP Economics Overview. It is more of an overview than a presentation of proper final results, as you've seen tonight, as I have joined the project much later than everyone else. I am endeavoring my best to catch up and get my results ready, but I'll just kind of be walking you through more so what I have done as of yet than to walk you through a final project. What I've been up to is we've been looking at 3 representative ranch locations in the Boreal region. Our current one, our model site is in Lac St. Anne County, an Aspen Parkland site in Ponoka County, and a grasslands ranch in Newell County. All of our things are in Alberta, just so everything can fall under the same tax structure and government oversight. We have 2 operations per location. We're looking at a beef crop mix operation that also runs 150 head herd, and an exclusively ranching operation that runs a 700 head herd. I'll kind of be talking more about this later on, as it's much easier to explain than having to walk through the interaction between the beef and cropping sides in the mixed operation. Then I'm looking at 5 grazing management treatments, a continuous that it serves as our base case, what we're calling traditional rotational, which is an 8-paddock grazing management system, our minimalists AMP, a 30-paddock system, a slow AMP system at 50 paddocks, and a much faster AMP system at 115 paddocks. The general structure of the model is we're looking at things over a 20-year time horizon, as that's kind of the general length of fencing and water system infrastructure. The model incorporates price risk. It can draw kind of randomly from historical prices and project into the future. So there is some element of different pricing year to year, some uncertainty in the model. It also involves production risk, drawing from different weather. So not every year produces the same weather. So we get different yields, different production levels, etc. Our ranch does participate in some business risk management sort of items, mostly agri-stability. Not that it's a major importance to this discussion, but it is there. And our southern ranch is targeting 250 kg animals for sale. Our northern sites are targeting 285 kg animals. Now, the big kind of bulk of my project has been trying to figure out how to include and price the interactions of what switching to an AMP system from continuous, which is our base case, would entail. The literature is pretty clear that utilization does increase as intensity increases. So we're seeing the utilization of our ranches increase as we're going through our more intensive systems that I'm modeling. The literature was not as confident about the impact on productivity. For my initial simulations, I've been keeping productivity per acre constant in terms of biomass production. However, I do have the ability to change it, and I have been, which I will explain later on. Our grazing days increase as our intensity increases, kind of keeping in line with the numbers you saw earlier on. I've been drawing from the project's data. Our rate of gain also decreases with intensity, which I've been finding from talking with vets. The biggest stuff I've been having trouble with, and which is why I don't have complete results, just kind of preliminary things to show you, is dealing with the pricing of infrastructure and the changing of labor requirements, and therefore the farm's labor cost. The big thing I've been looking at is this difference between putting in all permanent infrastructure, which is like 3 barbed wire fencing, versus kind of temporary electric fencing that people move every time. And then what this means for the impact on a farm's labor, which is proving quite difficult, which I will talk through later. So here, looking at some numbers, this is assuming a ranch with permanent fencing, no change to its labor requirement. And as you'll see, the optimum kind of production system is an 8-paddock system. We're seeing fairly considerable increases to it, and AMP is causing fairly considerable decreases to a farm's income. When you go about kind of fiddling with things to see what changes, to make kind of a slow AMP system better, if the farm puts in all permanent infrastructure, all 3-wire fencing and less mobile watering systems, you need large bumps to utilization across the board. Productivity would have to increase by amounts that are pretty unrealistic. And you'd have to see pretty major decreases to the value of your infrastructure cost. And this is all coming into pretty big dollars at the end of the year. $45,000 a year for a minimum system that you'd be losing as opposed to sticking with an 8-paddock system. $75,000 a year for a slow kind of 50-paddock system. And seeing as this last one compares fast to slow, it takes almost $145,000 a year you're leaving on the table compared to a traditional system if you put in all permanent infrastructure. But that is kind of a big assumption, a big if. Not many people are going to do that. You see a lot of farmers put in some more permanent fencing into places they know they kind of want it, but generally through the conversion and even later on, they run lots of temporary electric fencing. Here on the other end of the scale, just kind of paint a picture around what I'm looking at, are the results of a farm that exclusively puts in temporary fencing, but I must say that this is not factoring in any increase to the cost of labor. This is assuming rather magically that these fences sort of move themselves, because I haven't yet been able to find a way to really truly price this change in labor in a way that I think is accurate. But looking at this to kind of give us a very low end case, the faster AMP system does increase earnings the most, but it should be noted that it's not increasing it very much compared to slow AMP, and will have a much higher labor requirement for this fast AMP. Traditional does still see an increase in profitability compared to continuous, but is dwarfed by the AMP systems here. If we're going to look at kind of playing around with things, to make traditional better than slow in this system, you would need a big bump to utilization, productivity would have to go up, and infrastructure would have to decrease by more than 100,000, or more than 100%, sorry. A 50 paddock system beats the lower paddock systems by almost $22,000 a year. To make fast better than slow, you can see they're quite tight, well within any sort of margin of error. Utilization within 0.3% change, productivity within a 1% change, and infrastructure within 10%. Per year, it's only a change of about $3,000. When I do get around to factoring in labor and find a way to do that more accurately, I don't expect to see this $3,000 a year. Not very likely to hold, but possible. So in conclusion, there's so much work for me to do before this project wraps up, but I am doing my best to kind of get to the end here. The profitability of switching to AMP from continuous has a lot riding on the change in the cost of labor and how much infrastructure it takes a given farm to make this switch. It's possible and likely that the results I get will come down to an individual operation's own labor versus capital capabilities, which I'll be exploring a lot more in depth once I kind of get the price of labor and access to capital nailed down much more specifically. So thank you to the project and thank you for listening. I look forward to giving you a lot more in-depth and hopefully more useful economic analysis later on when the project wraps up and I have a little more time. Thank you.
Thank you, Kyle. So I have just a few summary comments to offer. There. Oh, didn't work. So some of the benefits from AMP grazing that we heard this evening included improved water infiltration into the soil, and part of that related to the increased vegetation biomass and litter that occurs with AMP grazing, as we heard from Jessica's presentation. These two factors, the increase in litter and the increase in water infiltration, provide buffers against drought, so reduces the amount of variation in production from year to year, which is a very important consideration for ranchers. One of the things that at least I was surprised by was to learn about the increased absorption of methane into the soil associated with AMP ranching. And another very clear benefit associated with AMP ranching is a deepening in the soil horizon, meaning that there's more soil organic carbon stored under an AMP grazing regime. So I think that these are some of the highlights of what you heard this evening. But I also want to point to a new protocol that has been approved by the Climate Action Reserve out of California for Canadian grasslands. So we have a Canadian grasslands protocol for avoided conversion. The idea is that there are vast amounts of carbon in our grassland soils, huge amounts of carbon, and we want to keep that carbon there. And that's why a CAR is willing to pay ranchers to continue with permanent grassland cover and moderate to light grazing on their properties. Compliance markets have been developing, and if what Justin Trudeau tells us is going to happen, we're going to see a huge increase in the pricing of carbon. Right now, the payout associated with aligning on the Canadian grasslands protocol would amount to about $25 per acre per year to maintain your land in permanent grassland cover. These are for properties that have been in permanent grassland cover for at least 30 years. And the payouts associated with this carbon storage benefit, avoiding conversion to tillage, are coming from industrial payouts from excess carbon emissions, and those funds are managed by the Climate Action Reserve. There's a very useful webinar at this bluesource.com site that explains exactly the expectations of paperwork. We're talking a couple of weeks of paperwork at least just to get this organized, and assemblages of ranchers in an area would probably be a really good strategy to apply for these funds. But make sure that you make note of this this website and this webinar that's provided by BlueSource. And I think Paige has made a note of that website as well in her notes.
Absolutely. Thank you, Mark, and thank you to all our presenters this evening. Without further ado, we are going to open it up for questions. So you can type your questions in the chat feature, and you can also unmute yourself and ask your questions directly at this point. I'm going to put you on the spot, Christine. I saw your question up in the chat. And if you could just unmute yourself and share that one to get us going, that would be fantastic.
Sure, you bet. I have to find my my question because it has lost my mind. Left my mind. Sorry.
Here it is. How does below ground biomass equate to carbon sequestration? So being around, but there was no difference below ground. Knowing what we do about carbon sequestration and AMP practices.
Thank you. Yeah, and that was during Jessica's presentation, so perhaps she could take the first stab at it.
Yeah, thank you, Christine. That's an excellent question. And like I said, my understanding that there will be further analysis that integrates all of these data sets together to tell one unified story. And I think that'll be one of the key questions we explore going forward, because it is a bit of a puzzle. And I would ask the soil and gas members of the team to maybe add their thoughts here, because yeah, all I can really show is that there were differences in below ground root biomass. Like I referenced in the comments, I do think litter is playing like quite a large part in this, as well as the increased production as well. Because you can imagine with more biomass, there's likely more carbon getting integrated into the soil over time. It doesn't all have to come from the roots, right? But yeah, I'm sure the other members of the team have thoughts as well.
Yeah, so I think Lyo's presentation dealt with that quite directly.
Yeah, and I just want to chime in that roots are a real tricky one to actually measure, because there's such a huge pool of biomass below ground. But while we can sample above ground pretty quickly, we can gather up and clip all kinds of stuff and quantify it. When you're trying to quantify roots, it becomes a matter of how much physical soil can you pull out of the ground? Can you get enough of it from a given area to have a robust sample? And then even when you're sorting and cleaning and sieving that all out, there's going to be a certain amount of loss. And I'm really intrigued by Jessica's numbers, because there's a huge difference there. But statistically, it may not be showing a difference, and yet it's sure pointing towards this very large, almost 50% or 60% increase in roots. And we saw the same thing with our benchmark sites in Alberta, where we looked at roots in over 100 grasslands, with or without grazing. And if I remember my numbers, we were at about 12,000 kilograms per hectare outside with grazing, and about 10,000 inside without any grazing. And yet it statistically wasn't different. And yet a 20% increase in biomass, if it was real, would be really substantial if you think about that accumulating over time. So I think a lot of the issues with root biomass quantification deals with the challenge, the physical challenge that we have as scientists in trying to quantify what's going on below ground. But the proof is in the pudding, as Mark put it, that the carbon is there. It's showing up in what Lau presented. And so, that it's probably going to be, there's a way to maybe tease apart these relationships at some point. But I wouldn't discount the difference that Jessica is seeing, just like the difference that we're seeing in that pattern in the Alberta benchmarking data.
Yeah, so just to add on to Edward there, I think the key takeaway is variability of root biomass is very, very, very high. And as he's alluded to, part of that is that each core is so small, right, in relation to all the roots that are underground. You're going to see a lot of variation there, which is true for all studies. Like I am very confident we followed like the highest amount of rigor we could have for the resources we had in the field. It's just they vary so much, which contributes to that uncertainty.
Jessica, did you use a fixed depth for the collection of samples, roots? So
roots were sampled to 15 centimeters deep, and it was a 2.5 inch diameter for the core. And we know that the vast majority of roots are going to be within that top horizon, which is why we didn't go deeper. So yeah, it's not all the roots, not at all. Prairie roots go so deep, but logistically, I'm confident we've captured the majority of them for that soil layer.
We have another question in the chat here from Wayne. Do you have any data completed on how much carbon has been stored over the 3-year period?
So for the soil cores, we just collected them all at once. We're not analyzing variability of soil across time. It's just a one-time collection of the soil cores, and then we analyze them for carbon once. We're not repeating the collection of samples to have that variation across 3 times.
So we don't have trend data in soil carbon. We just have a one-time sampling on soil carbon.
Thank you.
I guess fairly similar to the root problem. The soil carbon is the same problem. The background is really large. So couple of years or 2-3 years, it's going to be really difficult to detect changes over that 3-year period.
We have another question in the chat from Kim. Sorry, did you want to?
Yeah, I just wanted to make a comment on the actual size of the carbon pools, because you did show what the magnitude is of the pool sizes are, and it is huge. Yes. The numbers are up to, I don't remember what your top end is, but I think it was up around 160 or 180 or 200 tons per hectare. It's huge. So, you know, what Scott is talking about is trying to find a detection of, let's say, an added ton or 2 or 3 out of, let's say, if you're starting with a baseline of 180 tons, which is, you know, you would need a lot of years to accumulate enough carbon, and in really intensive sampling. So we're talking about massive pools of carbon below ground, massive.
And probably Kim's question came from 3 years measurement. We measured greenhouse gas emission from in situ condition only for 3 years. So I was coming to your ranch each summer from 2017 to 2019 to measure the in situ greenhouse gas, but not the soil carbon. Soil carbon was measured, sampled just once, and it was analyzed to see the management difference according to our experimental design. So in situ greenhouse gas emission was presented by Geelong.
Thank you, Bharat. Another comment here from Tom. So inquiring to see if you've looked at the research by Dr. Teague from the Texas AMU for Shell Canada, especially regarding methane and hydrology with AMP grazing. Maybe more of a suggestion on that one.
I assume Mark was going to take that one.
Well, so we certainly know of Richard Teague's work, and Richard was instrumental in helping us with the design of the project and identifying the AMP ranches across our study area. And I guess what I would claim in our research in defense of our project is that one of the things that we did, I think, really well is the study design, so that we are confident in our results, and that there's been a lot of discussion in the Savory Teague group about whether science can really even cope with AMP grazing, and I think that's crazy talk. And absolutely, science can deal with it, and it's a matter of having a proper study design. And so that was the motivation and part of why I wanted to focus on this research effort.
We have another question here around rest to grazing ratios. So the RGR seems important. Can you tell me representative values for AMP and neighboring AMP? And I'm actually going to expand on that a bit, because I had a question myself around the rest to grazing ratios. I wanted to know if stocking density had been considered in those ratios.
Okay, yeah, so there's multiple questions there. So the RGR is a combination, or it reflects an integration of both the length of the active grazing period during what I call the sensitive time of active green up and growth, which across most of Western Canada, growth starts as early as April 20th. And then we have that really rapid growth phase through May and June. Then it starts to slow down in July. And by the time we get to the end of July, if you're in the mixed prairie, it's starting to brown down. You might be almost in the dormant season already. And certainly if in the parkland or the boreal, you're on the verge of at least starting to slow down. So many producers will openly acknowledge, and they admit they were very good in the surveys about highlighting that they manage their grass and their animals differently during the early part of the growing season as opposed to the back part of the growing season, because they're trying to adjust the impact of their animals on the vegetation and associated soils differently during the front end as opposed to the back end. So that's why we computed an initial grazing period, okay, to adjust for how sensitive, and if we drag Richard Teague back into this, it was a measure of how sensitive producers are to adjusting the length of that grazing period, but then also looking at how long a recovery period are producers giving before they come back and expose those plants and the soils to animals again. And many producers were very explicit. They would say 60 days or 80 days or 40 days. And so by integrating the length of that minimum rest period and the length of the maximum length of the within growing season grazing period, we can compute basically for every day of stress. This is a way to think about it. For every day of stress, how many days of rest did you grant that given pasture? Now, to come back to your question, Christine, about stock density is really about herd effect. So you can run exceptionally high stock densities in a 1 day period. You know, if you cram 150 cow-calf pairs into 5 hectares in 1 day, your stock density will be sky high. So that's why, coming back to Mark's point as well, we designed this study in order to separate out the nuanced grazing practices, which includes stock density, herd effect, from stocking rate, which is widely acknowledged in the literature as being probably the most important factor regulating the productivity and sustainability of pastures and rangelands. But also more nuanced things like the start of the grazing season, and then this rest to recovery, or grazing to recovery ratio. And I think it's the ability of our study to partition those things apart, as opposed to Richard Teague, who basically lumps everything into either AMP or continuous. So when Richard Teague came up here and had meetings with us, and we described these slow rotational grazing that was very common in Western Canada, he basically attributed most of those to continuous grazing. He said, no, they're continuous grazing. And so that's kind of neglecting the fact that with 20,000 beef producers in Alberta, we have 20,000 different grazing systems that are going on. So we need to quantify the nuanced grazing practices to really be able to partition out and separate stock density from stocking rate, from that grazing period, from that ratio, that recovery ratio. So that's what we're trying to do, is really develop operational tools that producers can use to maybe identify what the benefits are. And I'm going to bring Tim's data back into this, because I think it was very interesting that it wasn't that the factor that was regulating the favorable increase in water infiltration was the rest to grazing ratio. It was making sure your pastures, they could have impact, no problem, but they needed that recovery period. It wasn't about stock density or herd effect. That's not where the benefit came from. Wasn't from herd effect, it was from the recovery period. And so I think that has profound insight into what's driving the benefits here.
Another comment in comparison with some of the previous work that Richard Teague has done, we have a very short growing season here, and we haven't talked about the seasonality issue, and we're restricted in how many times you can visit during the course of a season. Where in many of Richard's sites, they had a rotation of four times a year kind of thing, and we just can't do that during the shorter growing season that we have in Alberta.
Yeah, I really appreciate that comment and the ability of the rest to, or the ratio, the RGR, and acknowledging the spectrum of grazing. So grazing management is really a spectrum. I think the study did a great job of recognizing that. We do have another question from Kim here in the chat. I believe this would be for Tim. There was assessment of water infiltration. Was water holding capacity also assessed? One of the values of increased AH horizon is increased water holding capacity to enable longer grazing, increasing the season and keeping soils cooler.
Yeah, thank you for this question. We don't have this data. So for hydrological processes, we really just have the water infiltration data. I would guess it really comes down a lot to texture as well, like the soil composition regardless of any grazing. So really regional variation, but we don't have measurements for water holding capacity.
We also have a question from Brad here in the chat, kind of relating back to our earlier conversation around stock density. So can you relate your stock density to pounds per acre?
So I just went back to my slide because I had to compute it on my calculator. So if I convert the animal units per hectare over to pounds per acre or kilograms per hectare of live weight mass, where the AMP averaged, so this is averaged across all the AMP producers, a little over 50,000. So kilograms per hectare, pounds per acre. And I know that some AMP producers are going to be higher than that. There's some that are pushing probably 70, 80, 90, 100,000. And Brad can correct me. I see Doug's got a note in here. 150 pairs at 1,800 pounds per pair is 270,000 over 5 hectares. So yeah, if you divide that by 5, that's running about 50,000, which is the number that I basically just gave. So 50,000, but you compare that to the non-AMP, and they were running a fraction of that. It was less than 10%. So they were running maybe 5,000, 3,000. So that's the difference if you're trying to put that into scale in terms of pounds per acre, because I know a lot of beef producers like to run it. They like to use those units.
Thanks for expanding on that. Again, I'm going to encourage, you can also unmute and share your question directly. Little Zoom trick that I've picked up. If you press and hold your space bar, it'll unmute you for the duration of while you have your space bar held down. So feel free to unmute.
Can I ask Brad a question? Because he indicates he's pushing 3 million pounds per acre.
Certainly.
So how long is his, Brad, if you'd be willing to just share with us, you know, you're running how many head then in how small an area for how long? Are these like 8-hour grazing periods or 12-hour? Two-hour moves. Okay, so that's where the ultra high stock density is coming from. But that means those animals are getting moved 12 times a day.
Eight moves a day we're seeing.
Oh, eight moves a day, averaging 1.5 million. Okay. You know, and I think in a more general sense, I've had this question thrown at me many times. You know, what's the right number of pastures to have for a herd? I don't have an answer for that. I'm really intrigued by Kyle's analysis that he's doing on the economics. And I think once he nails down the cost of fencing and water development, there's a really interesting exercise there. Because I think the answer is it's more than one, but in my opinion, it's probably less than 100. And some of you might disagree with me, but it's a law of diminishing returns. At some point, you're gonna reach a point where you're gonna get the benefits of more even utilization and regrowth and greater biomass and carbon sequestration and all of that. But we don't know where it is. Like we don't know where that asymptote is. And where that law of diminishing returns is. And every producer probably that's in the meeting tonight will have a different point at, you know, where they feel the sweet spot is.
I had an additional question as well, kind of relating some of what, Edward, you were talking about earlier on, in a tendency to see an increase in native seeding on these AMP ranches. And then Jessica, in your presentation, you talked about seeing higher species numbers and higher native cover on the non-AMP. So have you had any thoughts or discussion around why that might be?
I'd love to hear some producers answer that, since we have so many of them. I mean, is anyone willing to share what their philosophy might be on whether to include more diverse species or native species in mixes?
Sean McGrath here. I know on the study area that they did, it was, well, I mean, it was obviously a pasture that was put in, I think it was 1986. So in terms of species diversity, we probably had a 1986 thought pattern. Any new mixes we've seeded have had, well, they've had as a minimum 20 species. Would be a solid, like that would be a bare minimum at this point in time. So I think our philosophy's changed dramatically over time. Some of it's species availability, and some of it's just evolution.
And so what's the rationale for the high speed? Is it because you're trying to create that diversity up front, or is it because you're hoping that more of those species, or by adding more species, you'll get more of them established if it's a drought year, or you know, you get some kind of anomalous conditions?
So it's, yeah, covering our bases in terms of varying conditions, varying soil types and small ecozones across the field. Livestock nutrition plays a part of it, and also just establishing that diversity up front.
I would agree with Sean, and we've started including more natives in our latest pastures we sowed down. The biggest barrier is the cost of that native seed.
If I could jump in here, Tom Kravitz here from Athabasca, Alberta. My experience with the grazing is that there's a huge seed bank in the soil, and I call it pulsing, pulsing the grass, the different soil, or the different species start to express themselves because the seed is in the soil already. It's not a matter of going and adding any seed. It's a matter of the rest and recovery period, and having some herd effect that massages the soil. And the more that you can do that with different species of animals, the more the soil gets massaged by the different grazing pattern, the different hoof action. But I did have one question. I was just wondering, how many, what was the average paddocks per herd that you had in the study? I know that you said some AMP ranches had as many as 60 paddocks, but how many per herd?
So I flip back to my presentation. I don't have it on the screen, but it's a little over 60 for the AMP ranches. Now that's on average, right? Because no two AMP ranches are identical. I showed you that graph, that scatter graph, that showed that there's as much variation among AMP ranches as there is among, weeds in my garden. They're all over the place. So, that's an average. So you would have had some ranches would have had 80, 100, and some might have had only 40, 45, 35, on the low end. In contrast, the neighboring properties averaged more like about 5 to 6. So huge difference there in terms of the logistical kind of configuration of the AMP versus the neighboring. So are you running 60? Are you running 80? Or, you know, is 60 too low?
Per herd?
Yes.
In my opinion, that's too many. Because you had mentioned about the sweet spot. And for me, my sweet spot is keeping that grass in late stage 2 throughout the growing season. So where I'm located, that's kind of right about central Alberta. I like to have 15 to 18 paddocks because I can't get around to keep the grass in that late stage 2. So that's where I find that's the best spot is to keep the best number is 15 to 18 paddocks. And then I'm able to keep the grass in the sweet spot in that late stage 2.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think that kind of feedback is really useful for us because we're just dealing with the actual data. But when you talk to, you know, you'll hear folks throw around numbers all the time. Like Alan Saver will talk about 60 to 100 paddocks minimum. And I'm with you, Tom. I think that there is a law of diminishing return, but where that sweet spot is going to vary depending on labor and effort and vegetation and climate and soil and all kinds of factors.
Certainly, but the reason that I have that I like 15 to 18 paddocks per herd is again going back to that sweet spot, and that's where I find that. I get enough ground cover, and then I'm also able to get enough production.
I hate to interrupt the great discussion taking place here, but just to be respectful of everyone's time, we're about 2 minutes away from our scheduled time slot for the workshop. So I wanted to do a couple of closing pieces, and then we are all more than welcome to stay in the line and continue this discussion. A couple pieces in closing. I want to say a big thank you to the ranchers that were able to join this call, and I hope some of you stay on so we can continue to hear some of your feedback. Also, thank you to all our presenters. It certainly creates some unique opportunities living in this virtual world. It allowed us to have all of these great presentations in one evening. So that is fantastic. So to wrap up this workshop, we are going to be sharing a survey along with the recording. So you will be able to access more information and provide some feedback in that survey. For anybody that is interested in learning a little bit more about the ALUS program and how that might fit in with your AMP grazing, there is an opportunity in that survey to request some more information. And we will also be sharing the slides. I just will confirm that we can distribute those after we wrap, but you'll have access to all this information. So anybody that would like to hop off the line, you're more than welcome to, but if there's interest in continuing this discussion, I'm gonna open it back up.
Mark, there's a question here from Wayne asking about the folks that are involved in the study, when they might see data or data summaries for their farms.
The data for individual farms we have sent upon request. Tim has been managing the data files, and it's very easy to pull off the data for an individual farm. So like I said, on request, we can provide that, and we will be making available any publications that come out of this as well. They will always be on my website. Through you can retrieve them through my website at the University of Alberta, and we can distribute those as well. That might be something that we could we could coordinate, is to distribute publications to the entire collection of ranchers as they appear. And the way publications work is that you send out, you finally get the paper ready to go, you submit it for publication, and the whole review process and publication can take a year easily. And so we're not going to have all the publications ready by the time our funding runs out, which is at the end of this month. But we certainly will be continuing to crank out publications over the next year or two. I would hope that we'd have a lot of the stuff out within the next year. And we can easily distribute all of those peer-reviewed publications to all of the participant ranchers. Just send the request to me, Wayne. My email address is boyce@ualberta.ca.
I'm gonna turn it on its head a little bit, and similar to Edward's question there, if there are any questions that perhaps our researchers would like to put out to any of the farmers and ranchers left in the room, you are also welcome to unmute yourself and see if we can get some responses. All right, hearing none, we can wrap up today's call. Thank you so much, everybody, for staying a little bit over and for the discussion and the presentations. Oh, one last question around how does species type affect AMPs? So livestock species type specifically. That's a very interesting question, and I'm not sure that the study touched on it, but I would love to hear a response.
There has been some work with bison in South Dakota. And in fact, we have a project evaluating movement of bison in Grasslands National Park and how that compares to the AMP structure. Does the way that bison graze the northern Great Plains have any sort of connection with the way in which AMP grazing takes place? And I would say probably not, in that the areas that are covered by bison are much larger than most of the ranches that we're dealing with, and the size of paddocks that we have in our on our AMP ranches. In the general idea that they'll graze an area intensively and then move on to another area, that's consistent with. And I can't speak to yaks. I've seen yaks. I went to Mongolia once.
Could I jump in here, Mark? This is Tom from Athabasca again. So yeah, I haven't grazed bison or yak, but I've done sheep, cattle, horses, and hogs all in one mob, and the results have been absolutely astonishing to me. You know, I mentioned a little bit earlier about massaging the soil, and when they're all together, it's just, honestly, it's just been phenomenal. I've seen where they have gone, you know, had a kind of a continuous graze for about 15 years under irrigation. That was, the sheep were just grazing that. And then what I did was, when I put the mob together, I went, like, there wasn't a lot of grass there. It was just mainly Kentucky bluegrass and some white clover. And the one paddock in particular, I put them in there for about 3/4 of a day, and then I moved them off. And in about I want to say it was about 7 or 8 days, there was like over a foot of forage there, whereas before it had, like I said, it was just Kentucky bluegrass and white clover, and all that those different hooves and I guess the different mulls, the way that they grazed, stimulated that grass and stimulated the dormant seed. And there was just I didn't count how many different species there were, but there was a huge increase. And every time that I have the chance to graze multiple species together, I jump at the chance, because what it does to the soil is absolutely phenomenal. It's a different situation if you're doing a leader and follower. It doesn't have the same impact on the soil when you have these species, like if you just had cattle and then come behind with the sheep, you don't get the same result. That's just my experience.
Yes, where I visited in Mongolia, they had 5 species of grazers on the same area, with yaks and cattle and horses and sheep and goats, and there may well have been stimulating the kind of soil massaging that you were talking about, but I don't know.
Yeah. The only thing, like each different species, like horses and cattle and the sheep, I can see how they benefit the soil. Hogs, I don't really know how they benefit the soil, but it's a neat group to watch in the social dynamics of the mob. And I think a big part of it is getting them trained to act as a mob. And once you're able to do that, they all stick together. And then you don't need a bunch of temporary fencing, where you're moving multiple times a day. What I find is that when they are trained to act as a mob, they stick together and they kind of go through the paddock all together.
Very interesting.
All right, everybody, you're probably already at home and you can't stay here. That's a night. Thanks so much for everybody's participation, and you'll see a survey coming looking for a little bit more feedback.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.